Hello, good morning, and welcome. It's Tuesday, March the 24th. Has the war in Iran started to ease? Has Donald Trump even backed down? And is his Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff travelling to Pakistan part of the end game? The markets may have gone into reverse somewhat, but who knows what the next day will bring. Nobody from the British Prime Minister downwards seems to have a clear idea, and everyone is planning in the dark. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Just yesterday morning, just remember that, you could see real flashes of red on the economic dashboard everywhere. Our cost of government borrowing was up, edging above 5%. That really is the danger zone. Some of the markets were starting to talk of a policy intervention becoming necessary.
Then at lunchtime, Trump announced talks with Iran had in fact been underway, he said, and he was doing a 5-day extension to the ceasefire to facilitate that. The markets rallied sharply, borrowing dropped, and the oil price fell too. Phew, maybe?
None of it is actually as clear as it might have seemed in the moments after that. By the time Keir Starmer appeared before senior MPs yesterday afternoon, he didn't appear to be putting too much store by Donald Trump's Truth Social post that sent the markets into reverse, telling MPs that, frankly, he just didn't know what the cause of the conflict would be, and not referencing at all a climb-down statement by Donald Trump.
So what is the Trump plan? Well, this morning, there's a striking story from Bloomberg reporting the Trump taco, Trump always chickens out, kind of line, which they are claiming came after US allies and Gulf countries privately warned the president the war was on the verge of becoming a disaster, and the dangers of following through with the earlier threat from the administration in Washington to bomb Iran's power infrastructure. They're saying specifically that regional partners, Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan, had told the US permanent damage to infrastructure would almost inevitably result in a failed state after the conflict ended. I also spotted an interesting take via the New York Times from its Mossad expert, Ronan Bergman, exploring the contradictions in Iran's war objectives, also from the Israeli side, and the dawning realization as things stand that the regime is damaged, but not enough so to produce conditions for an uprising to oust it. The suggestion being, and I also heard this last week from the UN Secretary General, that this has really been something that the Israeli side have been pushing for, Sam, when it comes to what they wanted out of this whole conflict. So I think we have a really interesting question here. We do know that the Trump administration can sometimes create situations by simply stating that they exist, regardless of whether the actual factual basis for that is true. And sometimes that has prevailed. It has simply imposed the will of the Trump administration. Is that something that could be happening behind the scenes here, even if Iran is claiming publicly fake news, etc., about the talks? But there does seem to be something about to happen, and some members of the close Trump penumbra about to head to Pakistan. It doesn't mean that nothing is happening. What's your take?
Well, we've only got the Trump account of what it looks like, so let's go through that. Under that version, Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and the Middle East advisor, Steve Witkoff, started discussions with Iran on Saturday, continuing through Sunday. And according to Donald Trump, Tehran agreed to turn over nuclear material in the country and not resume its nuclear program. It is very hard to see whether that is true, as you say, in practice. I think we will just have to wait at the coming days to see how things turn out, and whether negotiations, even with a part of the Iranian regime as it remains and as it stands, actually hold sway with the whole of it. That's a big, big question that analysts have been warning about.
My guess is, as well, there's a desire here to smoke out whether the regime still really exists, and whether the successor, Khamenei, is really fully operational. That might also be part of this testing of Iran, as you see, uncertain where that goes. But what is clear is that the UK rollout of schemes and measures to mitigate the damage back home is underway and taken very seriously by the government, acting at pace. We'll hear from Rachel Reeves in Parliament later, but Keir Starmer made the basics of the plan clear yesterday, saying he's looking at targeted energy support for households until the end of the year, equally making clear this isn't a splurge and there isn't just money for everyone, although pretty much everyone is going to be affected by the price backwash of what is happening. Help for businesses, the suggestion is, will take a lot longer to work out. And there is still a big hole where the defence investment plan should be. I noticed Keir Starmer turning pretty pink in a testing session in the liaison committee yesterday, and a bit tetchy when questions were put about that across parties. It is clearly becoming a personal pressure point for him, and he does react as if he is under attack on that issue.
Yes, I thought the manner in which Bernard Jenkin, the Conservative defence veteran, was putting the questions was designed to rile up the Prime Minister. So the style in which he was responding to perhaps different from others on the liaison committee. But look, brace yourself for an important big moment from Rachel Reeves today. She wants to own the policy response to the Iran war. That's what's going on. She has chosen to do this herself. And this has got important policy and political implications, Anne, because what's going on is the Treasury want to set out the parameters and stop others from setting out the parameters of what they're going to do next, because we are right on the precipice of what this country can afford to do. And so the Treasury, with the closest knowledge of what the markets will wear, want to be in the driving seat right now. There is a huge spectrum of cabinet opinion about how to respond to the Iran war. Don't think it's all one singing nest of birds. It stretches from Ed Miliband at one pole of the cabinet to Peter Kyle right at the other pole of the cabinet. And I can tell you, therefore, the markets want and need Rachel Reeves to be in the driving seat, because there's still a sense of crisis this morning in the financial world. They say that they are living and breathing truth social posts. And I had one source saying overnight that there are calls not only between the Treasury and big banks, but possibly Treasury and retail banks, fueling that sense of crisis today. So today, Rachel Reeves will set out some limited things, but more importantly, some of the principles that she's going to adhere to. And this is all about reassuring the markets that the government won't do a Liz Truss. Here's the internal message that she is sending from the Treasury to her colleagues. There will be no movement on fiscal rules. There will be no big jump in borrowing. The markets won't wear it. We can't wear it as a government. Instead, here's the big thing that the Treasury want listeners of this podcast to know. Rachel Reeves commissioned a couple of weeks ago a lessons learned review from previous energy shocks, particularly the Liz Truss one. And one of the things that's going to be put front and center today is a stat about how much we are still paying back as a nation from the Truss era for money paid to the wealthiest top 10% who received help with the Truss package. So that's the kind of thing that she's going to signal she has worked out, and therefore, by implication, signalling that there are limits to the amount that this government's prepared to spend in the way it responds. The second big message from Rachel Reeves is that there's a bit more time to develop the government's policy response than you might have thought if you listened to the Prime Minister yesterday. It sounded when you listened to him like we could be getting help all the way through to December, pretty much out the traps today. But she will make clear we have time. The price cap is in place. The existing lower price cap will be in place until June. Then we're in some months when heating is less used. So to do the fair and responsible thing, take a deep breath. We're not going to rush. We're going to work out who needs it most. So really big messaging to Labour MPs, cabinet colleagues, and most of all the markets who have been in that absolute sort of roller coaster, turbulent mood over the last few days. That's why Rachel Reeves needs and wants to own this moment.
Great behind the scenes detail of the Treasury thinking. It reminds me that you put your finger on something that it was sort of in the back of my mind, Sam, which is this really all about controlling timelines as well as making the right policy calls? Because there has been a sense of the government being very fizzy and very reactive and wanting to sort of go out there and reassure people, the electorate. At the same time, the more you do that, the more you look like you're on the hamster wheel and you're trying very hard to mitigate the fallout from the war, the more chance of actually getting policy response wrong or making commitments that you can't really keep up with. So I thought it was really interesting you were suggesting that we're going to have a sort of I don't really like the phrase, but I'm going to use it, an Iron Lady moment from Rachel Reeves. Fascinating. Officials telling Playbook that they are exploring various options around how this means testing of energy bill support could be provided and on what grounds that would work. But we've seen the difficulty in that before. Sometimes it just ends up being very simply linked to benefits like pension credits, but then you also have groups who are not included in that and who are really at the sharp end as well. I sense that there is a bit of a gap opening up here, which your analysis says Rachel Reeves is adamant she's going to close today, between Labour MPs and some ministers who are treating this a bit like a financial crisis and saying you absolutely have to have this suite of responses ready to roll, otherwise the public will panic, basically, and they'll lose even more faith in the government. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have Jim O'Neill, the former Treasury Minister, but more importantly, a very respected a chief economist at Goldman Sachs back in the day. He told my Politico colleague Esther Webber the government shouldn't get sucked into reacting to every external shock, which is kind of code for not getting carried away with ornate and expensive plans to reassure us until we know what we're really in for. So where does this vibe on the economy go? I mean, do you go then towards more reassurance, more activity, or do you say, hang back a bit, let's see how this plays out?
Well, the Treasury are setting their red lines, no loosening of the fiscal rules, no sign of the tax lock being weakened. But you're right, Anne, that requires targeting. And targeting means cliff edges. I mean, the one idea you could do is only to give additional help to people on universal credit, but then there's a cliff edge for people earning somewhere between £20,000 and £30,000 a year. And cliff edges mean pain. But for all the messages of reassurance among those in the city watching Rachel Reeves today, those kind of questions are prompting worries. Many have banked the fact that there is going to be more spending on this targeted support. It won't cost nothing, right? But they're starting to worry about where this takes us for the Labour Party in the autumn, because what you're seeing with this cost of borrowing edging up, even if it's off its slight highs, is that the headroom is being squeezed. And already Reeves's spending plans were looking like they couldn't hold, given everything that we're talking about with the need to spend more on defence. Surely money has got to come from somewhere. So the question that's being asked, I'm told, in the city more than any other at the moment in financial city circles is, regardless of Iran, at some point, aren't there going to have to be big fiscal levers to be pulled? And if so, which? Now, it's not the fiscal rules. If Rachel Reeves stands for anything as Chancellor, it is to hang on to them. So does that mean tax? Is the moment of a brave government taking this conflict and going, this just rips up our calculations, and those promises we made in the manifesto not to touch some of the big taxes, they're just out of the window? Could there be a big broad-based tax rise for the third time in this parliament? Or does something like the triple lock have to give? But city analysts at the moment cannot see the way out of the government's fiscal bind. And this only is amplified by the shock that we're having, but was kind of the contours of it were there already. How are things sustainable in the medium term was and is a question the city is asking.
A crisis of this proportion does give the opportunity, doesn't it, to say, look, things are different. Everybody knows things. Everyone can watch on their TV screens and see what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz and also the wider impact of the war. So you have almost like a COVID-like moment, perhaps, when governments can say, whatever we were doing before, we're going to do something else. We're going to go against previous dispositions, or in this case, our ironclad fiscal rules, as Rachel Reeves used to call them. But you are still in a territory here, Sam, where it's fine for city analysts to say that, and they may have a good factual base for doing so. The electoral damage then falls on the government that has to then make the case, and we'll have every opposition party saying this is exactly the opposite of what you told us. You can't believe a word that Labour says, and then you have to go back into saying, well, it's not our fault, blame a mixture of Donald Trump and Iran. You are into a territory Sir Humphrey would have said was very brave with that look that he always appended to that statement.
Nobody's saying it's easy at all. It's interesting, if Rachel Reeves is out and about reading, sort of laying down the law, reading the Riot Act and reassuring the market, it was Ed Miliband reassuring Labour MPs last night. Interesting how Keir Starmer's government can face both ways at the same time. He was out in front of the PLP. His tone a week ago seemed to suggest a much bigger scale of bailout, not wanting to see consumers hurt by energy price rises, but that doesn't seem to be where the Treasury is at the moment. But he's also in the firing line, or at least having to make the case in favour. Another big policy decision that Ed Miliband, more than anyone else, has owned, which was his plan to prevent more drilling in the North Sea. And last night he was out and about telling Labour MPs there would be no backtracking.
Yes, Playbook following up on that meeting last night, MPs telling us he was adamant, he was resisting the drill, baby drill kind of solutions being put forward. Certainly Reform and Tories united on that, but also quite a lot of agitation from unions in Scotland representing oil and gas workers who've also been a lot more forthright about that. He is sticking to his mantra that we need a diverse energy mix to get us off fossil fuels. He called it a roller coaster of being attached to fossil fuels as a major part of our energy supply. On the North Sea, he was really punchy, telling that meeting, anyone who tells you new licenses in the North Sea for drilling will make any difference to prices, not telling you the truth. And he then goes into his thesis that as gas is bought and sold on the international market, that's where the price is set. But the government did give the go-ahead for oil and gas exploration in Rosebank and Jackdaw gas fields in the North Sea. That ended up in legal limbo last year, but there's plenty of pressure on Ed Miliband to weigh in behind that. I think if he put his weight behind that, which he clearly doesn't want to do, he probably could force a go-ahead on that. So it'll be really fascinating where the Chancellor lands on this issue, because the question seems to me that Ed Miliband dodged last night with backbenchers is it's not cost that's really the issue here. It's grounds of supply when you hit crises and intermittency, and that's really where people who are pushing perhaps for more oil and gas exploration, putting aside the green and environmental arguments, which obviously weigh heavily here, they're not always talking about cost. They're talking about other factors of energy reliability. So I think there's a bit of a tension there between Ed Miliband and others, even on his own side. But where does all of this leave the scores on the doors in the polling? Sam, reveal.
The weekly YouGov, Sky, Times voting intention has Reform UK out on top on 23, -2 on the week. Labour on 19, +2 on the week. Conservatives unchanged on 17, Greens 18, Lib Dems 13. So the Greens back down in third place. I looked at those scores, Anne, and I thought we're midterm. And that's not a bad position for a government to be midterm, with Labour second on 19%. You could still see Labour providing the next Prime Minister of some sort with numbers like that. The Greens receding, presumably because of the publicity impact of Denton and Gorton receding. I was on the Commons Terrace last night, and the sort of I kept being told Keir Starmer is safer than you think. Let's see, I'm sure we'll discuss that more. But Lisa Nandy out and about in an interview with House magazine, my friend Francis Elliott, telling him that should Andy Burnham want to stand again for Parliament, he should be allowed. I have actually got more polling on the public view of the character of potential candidates, and we'll go through that more another day. It's quite spicy, I have to tell you. But one thing comes out loud and clear. Andy Burnham is far, far, far ahead of everybody else, including and especially Angela Rayner amongst the general public when it comes to trust and competence and things like that. So Andy Burnham, just for my money, may not be in Parliament, but is the one to watch when it comes to sort of uniting the country a bit more, even if he isn't in there as in Parliament as Lisa Nandy would want him to be.
Oh, that's tantalising. We must take a deeper dive into that. Andy Burnham's trust and competence, the TNC candidate. Of course, he does have that Greater Manchester, big metropolitan area degree of success to boast there behind him. It's just a good reminder that everybody else jockeying for power is attached to a government, which for all the ups and downs outside its control, does struggle sometimes to show that it's delivered. So Andy Burnham might well be the beneficiary of that. Let's take another look at that on a different day. What else you got for us?
Psychologists say that people listening to podcasts often remember the last thing that they hear, which is just as well, because it's I've left the best till last. Big shout out today for a major investigation into one of those corners of the state that just isn't working. We're looking at councils that wrongly block projects and developments and then have to pay out millions of pounds of your council tax when the decisions are overturned. I have done, and more importantly, producer Joe Cook has done a major piece of work. He's actually FOI'd every single planning authority in England and had to chase each one. Got hundreds of replies about how many so-called unreasonable decisions every council has made. It's in the thousands. Tens of millions of pounds has been paid out. This is council level, district level. So these are huge sums comparatively. It's not the billions that matter to the central government. And it's all because the system is sort of built wrongly. The structures and the incentives are built wrongly. Just very quickly going to pay you 30 seconds from basically one of Britain's leading planning lawyers about why the whole system is sort of topsy-turvy.
Members of planning committees have significant incentive to refuse planning permission because of perceived electoral benefit in that regard, but very little, if any, benefit to take a bold stance and grant permission where there's a vocal minority often against it, because there's no personal comeback to them and no electoral comeback to them because there's no visibility.
Now, the government were meant to fix all of this, I thought, but they haven't. Now, here's an interesting quote to end on, Anne. Actually, some in government tell me they really like and appreciate this piece of work that we've done. They tell me in private because it's absolutely in tune with what they worry and want to tackle, but they won't say so in public. Why? Because it's the local elections coming soon and they don't want to undermine NIMBY-leaning local Labour council candidates. So there's no public comment on it. And I suppose, really, that tells you about so much about what's going wrong here.
Doesn't it? And if the last thought is what people remember, can I just say absolute respect and quite a lot of sympathy for your producer Joe having to write hundreds of FOI requests to get that reporting across the line. I think everyone who's ever done that slog knows what a slog it is. So well done to you guys.
Right. Massive day again for us. We'll see what happens with Rachel Reeves and we'll be back tomorrow for Wednesday's Politics at Sam and Anne's. See you later.
Back on the roller coaster tomorrow.